we have a lot of discourse and a lot of discussion about the racial achievement gap, but what winds up happening is people don't really engage with the idea of race itself, right? What does race actually mean, right? So people often, will throw it into a regression equation. They'll talk about race as a variable, but they don't really unpack the meaning and the social meaning of race. And so if you think about race, you really have to look historically at what race has been used for. Race emerges at a time when you have colonization happening around the world, you have slavery happening, you have all these inequalities, you have genocide of Native Americans, and what race wound up being is a construct that allowed people to justify those kinds of exploitation. And one of the things that continues to exist is this idea that Black and Latino students are essentially not as intelligent as white students, and that they're likely to be violent or misbehave. And so one of the things that manifests itself in the contemporary context, based on this historic context, is this idea of the criminalization of Black bodies and Latino bodies, and the lack of intelligence that people perceive in Black and Latino bodies. And these things were readily apparent when we talk to people in the school context. And again, like I said before, we interviewed Black, whites, and Latinos to try to understand what was happening. And there was a pretty consistent story that people perceived that Black students and Latino students were not as intelligent, were not going to achieve as well, and were not going to behave as well as their white counterparts.
So there was that perception? Was there a reality?
There was definitely a perception, and what we think about with regard to the reality is somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once you've decided that someone is going to misbehave, you're going to scrutinize them a lot more. So what we found is that, for example, in the hallways in the school, students are supposed to have a pass when they're not in a class, when they're moving through the hallways during class periods. What we found is that white students would say, I never need a hall pass. I walk through the halls freely. And white students would say, but I know my Black friends can never do that, right? So there's this process of hyper-surveillance, and the likelihood of being in violation of the pass code is much higher if you're stopped than if you're not. It's almost like racial profiling and policing, right? So that was one of the examples of how this sort of played itself out.